actually verses 26 through 28. The entire context, I guess, would be at least the first 28 verses of the whole chapter there. We didn't take time to read all of that. And yet that's not really the lesson. The lesson that I wanted to mention is in that last verse, that 28th verse, and right about at the beginning of the verse where Daniel said to King Nebuchadnezzar, there is a king, or there's a God in heaven. Daniel answered in the presence of the king, the same king who had decreed his death. Of all the wise men and astrologers and those that were able to tell fortunes and whatever other advisors such as that the king had, including Daniel and his three friends, were to be slain. The scripture says in chapter 1 that Daniel was a child. Now I'm aware of the fact that the word child or children, as in the children of Israel, usually means descendants, and it could be of any age. But the word that's used here is a different word. In verses 3 and 4 of Daniel chapter 1, and again in verse 17, the word that's used here means a child or a young man, up to the age, I suppose, of what we might call adulthood. Probably Daniel was not more than a teenager, and perhaps a young teenager at this time. Daniel proclaimed the power of God as he stood before the king. A king who trusted in idols, even later would have people worshiping him. That was the age in which Daniel lived. That was the custom of the nations round about. They were all idolaters, and many times people were worshiping living men. And Daniel stood before the king who had decreed the death of all the wise men and proclaimed the power of God. Oh, your advisors can't do this, king. But there's a God in heaven who can. You know, the world in which we live isn't just a whole lot different from what Daniel saw in his day. We live in a very godless generation. Children in school are taught there is no God. Oh, maybe not in so many words directly, but God's righteousness and God's love are not taught them as the answers to such things as we do see in the world. Murder, rape, theft, divorce and remarriage, living together without marriage, the killing of unborn children and old people that we don't want to care for. Not too long ago, there was a highly respected voice among the medical and perhaps maybe one might say even philosophy circles in Great Britain, who urged that older people and the chronically ill have a moral obligation to die for the betterment of society. And there arose a great debate with strong voices on each side of that issue. There are forces in our world who are moving in that direction. Just kill the people that we don't want to take care of. Of course, we're already seeing that with regard to the unborn. And this country in which we live leads the world in that regard. We are a selfish, self-centered, materialistic society. And babies are just an inconvenience to some people. I would rather not have that problem of taking care of that baby, so we'll just pretend it's not a human baby and we'll just scrape that flesh out and throw it away. People who don't attend any kind of religious assembly on a regular basis or read the Bible every day and apply it to life, there's no reason, there's no motivation to do that because after all, there's no God anyway. This material thing that you can see and feel is all there is, according to the philosophy of the world. The question of God's existence is a practical consideration in our lives. Teachers and lawmakers speak of right and wrong, but their answers are not convincing because they're not linked to any kind of an unchanging standard, both in education and in law, in legislation. The standard changes every few years. Well, this is what the people generally want, so this is what's right for today. And the answers that are given are not consistent because they don't recognize an absolute standard. They do change from time to time. They change from person to person, even from locale to locale. What's right in this community may not be right 10 miles down the road or 50 miles or across the country. What's right in the city may not be right in the country. What's right for men may not be right for women. They have no standard. There's nothing that can serve as an anchor of the soul or of the social life of the human being. Without God, attempts to define right and wrong are nothing more than opinions. And opinions vary from person to person and time to time. Children are able to recognize what sounds like an opinion, and then they conclude that, well, opinion is a standard. That's what you feel like, so that's what's right. Why is that right? Because I said so. Because I want it that way. Why can't I do that? Because I don't want you to. Because I'm not ready to go there yet. It's all my personal feelings and my personal likes and dislikes, my wants, my opinions. And children grow up with that, and they learn that that is the standard that one should follow. And so we speak of, you don't hear this term too much anymore, I guess I'm dating myself, but we hear of juvenile delinquents. And what does that mean? They're delinquent of responsibility or from responsibility, even while juveniles. Why? Because they learn in early childhood to do what they feel like. And if somebody else doesn't like it, well, that's just his opinion. And so we have young gangs running around doing destructive things in society, even destructive things of their own lives, their own bodies, simply because they've not been taught that there is a God in heaven and a common single standard of right and wrong. We used to speak in our society of situation ethics. Now the term, I guess, is political correctness. But by any name, it both is inadequate as a guide for daily living because immorality continues to increase. And it's worthless to the soul. And it's worthless to man's eternal destiny. See, man has never seen eternity, but we profess to be able to control it by our actions and decisions. Well, if we live a good life, then we'll be in a better place. We have no idea what that better place is. We couldn't prove what we're saying, but we just want to believe that, and so we do. It's illogical. It's unprovable, because we don't believe in the first place that there is a God in heaven, and in the second place that He has spoken to us and given us a book. Rejection of the idea of the existence of God, the God described in the Bible, is both illogical and productive of despair and increasing immorality. Belief in the God who is, acceptance of the existence of God is both logical and productive of more good than all other plans of man combined. Life is successful when we follow God, and no combination of plans otherwise can even come close to measuring up to the peace and happiness and success and productivity of a life lived in following after God. One of the things that we need to recognize as evidence for the existence of an eternal Creator is that you are more than flesh and blood. You and I today are communicating. So there's more to you than what is visible. In Ecclesiastes chapter 1 and verse number 13, the wisest man who ever lived on earth wrote, other than Jesus, I gave my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom concerning all things that are done under heaven. Where'd that come from? He didn't say, I touched it, I heard it, I smelled it, I saw it, I tasted it, the physical senses, but there was something in me that made a decision and a plan to search out. That's not visible. Where did that come from? That doesn't evolve like maybe a fifth finger on a hand or something like that that man might suggest. Our Creator wants us to think. And you are thinking right now more than I am saying. Your mind is working faster than my tongue. And you're relating these words to all other kinds of thoughts, or maybe you're just ruling some of them out and thinking about something else altogether. But where's that come from? Flesh doesn't think. There's something more to us than the flesh. And Paul wrote of the spirit of man which is in him. I know what's in my mind. You know what's in your mind, but I can't read your mind, and you can't read mine. I can see your 2 arms and 2 legs. I can see you got 1 head on your shoulders. I can see all that. But I can't see the thoughts of your heart. What's going on in your dreams and your plans and your fears. I can't see your memories. They're in there. It's who we are. You dream when you sleep. You remember the past. You imagine the future. There's more to you than the physical. There's an argument for the existence of a wise master creator. To the church in Rome, in the 2nd chapter of his epistle, Paul spoke of our conscience that polices our thoughts, our words, and our actions. He says that your conscience will either accuse you or it will excuse you. What does that mean? What I say and what I do is being governed by some standard or some sense somewhere in my mind that compares my words and my actions with a base of what I consider to be truth, and my actions and my words are either judged consistent or inconsistent with what I believe to be right. Where'd that standard come from? Where'd that judgment come from? You believe that you are more than others can see. You are not your physical appearance, but you are your thoughts, your experiences, your dreams, your intentions. You love, you hate, you hurt, you hope. But none of these are abilities of the flesh. There's more to man than physical evolution. There's that which argues strongly in favor of a creator with a mind and the ability to plan, to design, and then with the power to actually cause it to be. And to put all of these things, to create your flesh and your physical human body as it is. And by the way, all physical bodies the same. I mean, every human being has got 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, and a tongue, and all that. You know, we're all the same. Why don't we all look differently if evolution is just hither and yon without design and plan? There's a designer, there's a planner, there's a doer, and he put into us all of these things that make us who we are. Man's nature implies the existence of God. Thinking, dreaming, remembering, imagining, and reasoning all have a source. Emotions, both pleasant and unpleasant, have a source. The flesh can't do these things, so the flesh cannot be the source of all these feelings, emotions. There is something non-physical, non-visible, that gave existence to that part of you which is non-physical and non-visible, and gave all those abilities order, distinctiveness, even, at least in some cases, control. You know, we may not be able always to control how we feel about something. The hurts and the joys, those just sort of spring out from who we are and how our experiences relate to who we are. But where did that come from? It had to come from some source. You don't draw sand from a water well. Oh, at the bottom, under the water, but there's water in the well. That's how you draw water out. If you want to build something out of wood, you go to a lumber yard, or you go to a forest and cut it down. You don't go to the sea and pick a bucket of water to build something out of wood. You go to the source that has what you want. Where did all these things come from? They have some kind of ultimate source that is characterized by all of these things. For example, let's take love. 1 John chapter 4 and verse number 7. Beloved, let us love one another, for, look at this, love is of God. That's where love came from. And everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. God is love, John said. And that's why love comes from God. God is the source of love. Where did love come from in our hearts? It came from our Creator God. He is love. That's where we draw love from, just as we draw water from a water well and wood from a forest. We draw love from its source, from God. In the Gospel of John, the first 3 verses tell us about the power of creation. And the third verse says, speaking of Jesus, all things were made by Him, and without Him was not anything made that was made. The evidence in the world around us argues for the truth of that statement. Evidence isn't proof. Evidence is a statement or a series of statements that leads to through the mental analysis to a conclusion which we establish as proof. But the evidence suggests that the statement is true. How will we analyze the evidence? What are you going to do with that kind of statement? Or the statement that begins the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Can anyone disprove either of these two statements? It cannot be disproven. And the evidence, which people sometimes say leads in another conclusion, may in some minds lead to another conclusion, but when all of the evidence is put together and reasoned upon correctly, the evidence points to the truthfulness of these two statements. But at least they're statements that we have to deal with. We have to be able to disprove the statement in order to be credible in arguing against their existence of a God in heaven. And then let's notice too, certainly, that the physical universe proclaims the existence of God. This is the statement of Psalm 19, and we've looked at this a couple of times recently. It's a very powerful statement that is something that every one of us knows by observation, but we may not think to put it in words. Clearer words could never be written on this particular statement. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth His handiwork. Firmament meaning the sky or the atmosphere over our heads. Why is it that this earth just somehow or other evolved an oxygen, a nitrogen atmosphere, and then creatures to live within that atmosphere? How is it that we need oxygen to breathe in, but we don't live in a methane atmosphere, for example? And all the other living animals around us, the same thing. We all breathe the same air. How's that possible? And how is it that our body is sustained by the water and by the food nutrients that are naturally occurring on this planet? How did that happen? By accident, by evolution? Just look out the window and there's evidence crying out, declaring the glory of a Creator. And then reading on a few verses, in verses 4 and 5 of the 19th Psalm, their line has gone out, the atmosphere, the sun, the moon, their line has gone out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. In them hath He set a tabernacle for the sun, which is as a bridegroom coming out of his chamber, and rejoices as a strong man to run a race. You might draw all kinds of thoughts or conclusions or images in your mind from that, but what I think what I see as a summary of all of it is it's a magnificently beautiful observation. Where did beauty come from? Accidents, explosions don't create beauty. You don't have to look very far on your evening news on the television or or searching through pictures on the internet to pick up some traffic report someplace and look at the automobile or maybe even the human body after an automobile accident on the highway, it doesn't create beauty. And explosions don't. Think of some of the earthquakes, tornadoes, volcanoes and such that we have experienced in our lifetime and in our world's history. All these things might open up and reveal to us strata of color, texture in the earth. But typically we don't consider most of what's created by that as anything beautiful. And so if we look at the evidence around us and if we begin to conclude that, Daniel just might have been right. There is a God in heaven. If we look at God, we see that God's existence, just the mere fact of His existence, provides for us a moral standard in our lives. Paul wrote to the church in Rome again in that first chapter, and beginning in the 18th verse, that the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness. And he goes on to argue that when people sin, suffering results. He says that's the natural punishment from God built into this world. If we don't do things right, we're going to hurt. If we try to climb up to the top of the house and try to fly off of it, we're going to jump out a ways and we're going to come crashing to the ground. We're going to hurt from that. It may not be because God looked at you and said, you need a good spanking. God doesn't look at individuals like that. That's just the natural fact of His creation. When we live within His pattern, His design, we succeed. Things go well. But when we don't, we suffer for it. As we look on down through this 18th chapter, notice in the first couple of verses, beginning with the 18th and down through the 20th, that God is known by that which He created. That which may be known of God is manifest, that is visible, shown to us, evident in them, that is in those people. For God has shown it to them. The people can see that and know that because God has showed it to them. Just the same way that we read in the 19th Psalm. And he goes on to specify in his own words this way: the invisible things of Him from the creation of the world are clearly seen. The invisible things of Him. What are some of the invisible things of God that we can clearly see in His creation? Beauty, order, His eternal nature, His ultimate power. Those aren't physical things that you could identify and point to, but they're evident in the product of what He did. What He produces shows us who He is. And these people knew God, but they imagined vanity. Verses 21 to 23. But when they knew God, they didn't glorify Him as God, neither were they even thankful, but they became vain in their imagination, and their foolish heart was darkened. I thought of an illustration a while ago. We were talking in our Bible class. Some people grow up in poverty, and they grow up, and they spend their childhood in poverty, and when they grow into adulthood, they think, you know what? You can live that way. You don't really have to have a great lust for things in order to be happy and successful and productive in life. And yet there are some people who grow up in that same poverty, maybe in the same household, and they'll come into their mature years and say, I'm never going to suffer that again. I'm not going to live that way again. What's the difference? Same conditions and the same source, the same surroundings. It all depends on the mindset. What I decide to do with what God has given to me. Some people will learn to be content with what we have in life, and some people will simply not. In this case, we're talking in Romans 1 about people who were not content with the evidence of the creation of God, the existence of God. And when we're not content with the evidence that leads to the conclusion that there is a God in heaven, then we're going to choose for ourselves to go on and do all sorts of ungodly things. And that's exactly what Paul describes of these Gentiles in Romans chapter 1. Continuing on, he says that they worship what they saw rather than him who made it. They worship and serve the creature more than the Creator, verse number 25. The Creator is blessed forever. But things that are created aren't designed to stand forever. They deteriorate, they decay, and they're gone. So today, even in our own society, we have people worshiping man himself. Humanism. They worship man for his accomplishments, but they cannot see worshiping him who accomplished the making of man. It's inconsistent. It's foolish. And in many cases, it's just determined willful ignorance. I don't want to hear about God. I don't want to know about God. I'd rather have it my way. I want to see the world the way I want the world to be. So they just ignore the evidence for the existence of God. Verse 27 talks about, well, I guess a pretty good description of the world in which we live. Men leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust one toward another. Men with men, working that which is unseemly. It's not suitable. It's not the way we're made. It's not good looking. The age in which we live might be called the homosexual age in American history. But it's an old story. And it all stems from a natural, from a chosen rejection of God. And we living in a time now in which there is generally a national rejection of God. Not by every soul, but by the general tone of society around us. You reject God, this is what you get. If there is no God, then why not? Everything is legal, everything is possible. It's the strongest man gets his will. I'm going to do what I want unless you're strong enough to stop me. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes when there was no king in Israel. And so the world does when they reject the concept or the idea, when they deny in their own minds the existence of God. In verses 28 through 31, God's fuller description of America today, I think. Even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a reprobate mind to do those things which are not convenient. I received a request to speak about the providence of God, and I've been working on a lesson in that regard, but here's a little bit of it right here, I think. Why are we suffering so much in our world today, in our country today, morally, legally, even maybe financially, materially, compared to what this country was, let's say, 50, 75, 100 years ago? Oh, there's been, economic advancement, there's been technological advancement, there's been a population growth, and those kinds of things. We wouldn't want to go back to some of what we had 100 years ago. But many of us who can remember 50 years ago, or 40 or 30 years ago, would very much like to return to some of the things and the way life was back then. Of course, part of that's natural too. Every generation speaks of the good old days. Solomon said, it's not wise to think, those days were good. We all think that. It's part of human nature. But really, honest, objective observation by people who have lived through the times are well aware of the fact that our country has really gone downhill, morally speaking. And we suffer much. We suffer crime, violent crime, crimes against person, crimes against corporation, crimes against society in general. Why? Because the immoral thinking of those who have rejected the idea of the existence of God. Sometimes we look at the Bible and we say, well, that's the way they did. And then we look at the world today and we say, well, why is it this way? And we don't make the connection. Why should we be any different? Why do we think that we're above what people have always been? Solomon said in Ecclesiastes 1, there's no new thing under the sun. What has been is that which is, and what is that which will be. Societies go in cycles. And we're repeating a lot of the same kinds of sins that societies have experienced in the past when they have rejected God. And so it doesn't surprise us that there is a description of our country and of our times when we open up God's book that was written 2,000 years ago and more. Paul concluded that first chapter, that first argument with the Romans. In the 32nd verse, people who know the judgment of God, that they which commit such things are worthy of death, not only do the same, but have pleasure in them that do them. And when was the last time that you knew a wicked, criminal type person who wanted to behave alone? They all want somebody to come in, throw in with them, practice their wickedness, their immoralities, their sins, because misery loves company, and because we're social creatures anyway. It's not good that the man should be alone, and so whatever I decide I want to do with my life, I'd sure like somebody to agree with me and go along with me and do it. Whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, that's the way we're made. We want to be in a social relationship with somebody else. And so they know the existence of God, the evidence that's out there, but they just choose to ignore it. That's the world in which we live. Don't be like them. Recognize the existence, or recognize the evidence and draw the conclusions. Daniel was young, but Daniel knew there is a God in heaven. Those who wish it were not true have taught young people today that it is not true. But wishing doesn't make it so. In any wish that a person might have. Lots of children across the nation, around the world, are making a lot of wishes these days. Oh, I sure wish I'd get that. Many times it won't happen. We put so much thought in our wishes that when we don't get what we're looking for, we get really despondent. We get really sometimes even angry at the world. We're going to blame somebody and take it out on somebody because I didn't get what I wanted. Don't laugh at that, because that's exactly where some people are going to be on the judgment day. What will be your thought 2 seconds after you draw your last breath on this earth? Will you have received what you want? What you think you deserve? How are you living in this world? Those who have rejected the idea of God are going to be surprised. And they're going to be in great distress eternally. All of the evidence that we see in the world around us, even the evil that exists, supports the idea of the existence of God and the truthfulness of His Word. God says that when you reject God, there's going to be a conflict. There's going to be disagreement. There's going to be hostility in this world. Prejudice sometimes results in false interpretations of the evidence, but it is what it is. We have to look at it and reason correctly. Even when, that is objectively, honestly, look at what it is. Even when immorality continues to increase, as the Bible tells us, among religious persons, the evidence doesn't change. God's will, God's existence doesn't change. Leaders of business, political parties, athletes, entertainers, influence peddlers of all kinds are often not what they profess to be. There are hypocrites everywhere. Hypocrites in the church, certainly. Where else would you expect to find them? A hypocrite is a person who isn't what he professes to be. There might be people in churches who are one thing on Sunday morning in the assembly and something else all week long, or something else even in their heart as they sit in the building. Daniel knew that there is a God in heaven. What will we do? How will we deal with that fact? You see, if there is a God in heaven, then all the moral questions of life have already been answered. It's wrong to kill, to lie, to steal, to cheat. Anything else that's contrary to God's character, simply because there is a God in heaven. He made us, and He made us for something better than all of these things. We don't use our best china for a flower pot. We don't use our bodies for immorality. We were made for something better. When we sin, we commit sin against ourselves as well as against God. But God is watching, and He will judge each and every soul. You see, we are not in this world by accidents. Accidents don't create order. We're not here by mindless evolution. Mindlessness does not create a mind, nor, for that matter, does it create anything else. And we are here to praise Him, and He will judge our success in fulfilling that purpose. The purpose of our creation was to give God an object of His love, and then to give us, the purpose of our living here for this lifetime, is to give us an opportunity to learn Him and learn how to love Him and serve Him in this world. And so since all the moral questions are answered in the existence of God, are you accepting the answers? And are you standing firmly on them and living your life according to the true fact of the existence of God? And are you encouraging and teaching others to do so? Believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and repent from your sins. Because one day you're going to face Him. And you're going to be judged by His will and not your own. Confess your faith in Him and be baptized into Him so that you might rise to walk in newness of life, and having done all those things, go on throughout all of your life, every day, every hour, every minute. Walk according to the will of God in this world. And that will is described to us in this Bible, and this book also encourages you to come to Jesus right now, the first time you have opportunity to think about it. And so while you're thinking, why don't you come to Him while you stand and sing?